like probably most of you, like we grapple with a lot of questioning about a lot of our public systems right now, including education. Like is education delivering the outcomes that we kind of expect and what our public and parents expect it to? And I think most people agree it's not quite doing that. We don't really know what exactly the solution is, but wherever we're going to go, we think that the future of education has to be a little more personal, right? We really expect that when we drop our kids off in like second grade, that they're trying to understand who my kid is and develop their talents, right? And teachers try this all the time, principals do, but of course the system was not actually built for that, right? So we have a pretty big undertaking if we're going to try to transform a public education system. And so one piece of this, one small piece that we try to contribute is that we believe one of the biggest obstacles to actually getting to a system of education that understands and nurtures individuals is that this continued belief in the myth of the average person. And it sounds kind of like a bumper sticker slogan, right? My kid's not average, and then if your kid's not doing well, it's my kid can beat up your kid who's an honor student, right? That was, it's my favorite bumper sticker. But but this idea that group averages don't actually represent individuals is really important. And it's not, again, not just a bumper sticker, it's a deep scientific insight that's changed a lot of fields and I think has implications for the future of education. So today, I just want to do two things. I want to use some examples from my book to show you, first of all, what I mean when I say there's no average person, because again, it's more than a bumper sticker slogan. And then I want to use the bulk of my time to show you, if we're not going to use average and rank order as a way to understand kids, like how would we understand them? Because if we just say every kid's a snowflake, it's probably true, right? Not very useful foundation for a scalable education system. So I want to introduce you to what we call the principles of individuality. And there's 3 principles that we use in the science to understand individuals in a scalable way. So I was first introduced to the idea of average and the failure of average. In my doctoral work, I was being trained in brain imaging at Mass General Hospital. And if you were part of my study back then, and you said, this is how it works. I'd bring you in, I would put you in a scanner, I'd give you a task, then I'd scan your brain, and then kind of weirdly, I would actually smush all your brains together, average them out, and then publish the average brain. Like if you see anything, you see on Time magazine, they're like, this is the place for love in the brain, right? It's on average. That's all we ever publish. So in 2002, there was this kind of interesting study that really rocked our field. It's definitely a kind of a geeky kind of academic thing, but it was important for us. And it was a colleague of mine, Mike Miller. He published a study, very, very straightforward study on how the brain retrieves memory. And it was kind of a little boring, frankly, because we have at least like 50 studies on this exact topic. I honestly couldn't believe he got funding to do it again. Like, if you'd asked me back then, what do we know for sure from neuroscience? I would have said, we know the areas of the brain involved in memory retrieval. It's a done deal. Well, Mike had done this study, and he just so happened, usually we have people like me when I was a grad student doing all the work, right? And the scientist is actually somewhere else, writing more grants. And this time, Mike happened to be in the lab when one of the subjects was being scanned. And he saw the individual results, and no kidding, he told me, they looked weird, which is a scientific term. But it just didn't look like what he expected from previous studies on average. So he asked a very, very simple question that was really important for our field. He just said, I wonder how many of the individual brains in my study look anything like the average from those individual brains. So he looked. Let me show you a few. These are all people who perform perfectly on the task, so there's no performance differences. Just give you a few to give it a taste for it. This is the average brain. You'll have to trust me. This is how it looks in basically every other study. Here's one person's brain. Here's another person's brain. And another. And go on, because not a single one of them looked like the average. So Mike got worried, right? He didn't publish because this is how you ruin your career, right? Like, look what I found. Like, it was a technical glitch or like just random bad luck. But lucky for us, about 6 months later, it kind of nagged at him. And so he's like, I wonder if there's something to this. So he brought back, on his own dime, it was pretty great, didn't have funding for this, brought back the people from the original study. Put them in the same scanner, gave them the same task, got the exact same results. The average represented nobody. But what was really powerful is that the way that each individual brain was performing the task was stable. And it turned out your brain has somewhat unique ways of retrieving memory. And off of this insight, we learned all kinds of things that have been important. This will seem obvious to you, but it wasn't obvious to us. Different brains use different cues to retrieve memory. Some people tend to rely on verbal cues versus visual or spatial cues. Seems obvious, but when you average it all together, you get something that's actually an artifact and tells you actually nothing about how the brain really retrieves memory. So Mike was the first to show us there was no average brain, and if you built theories of how the brain works on average, they literally could apply to nobody, right? It's not a good funding model to do. Give us more money to tell you about nobody. But it turns out it's not just about neuroscience. In the last 20 years, in every field where we've gotten access to data about individuals, and we've actually looked, we found the same thing. So there's no such thing as an average cell. Now that's not a problem so much when you're cobbling together an average of how cells work, when it's just for a textbook where nobody can do anything about it. But when suddenly you can do cell therapy, it really, really matters that you understand the individual cells that you're affecting, right? There's no such thing as an average gene, no such thing as average genome, no such thing as average cancer, and we go on. And for me, the most important insight for the future of education in my mind is that we know for sure there's no such thing as an average student. If you buy that, and I'll try to prove this out even more with the rest of my talk, that it's not hard to see why we may be struggling to deal with this, is that our system was actually built on purpose from the beginning under the idea that average did represent most kids, right? And it wasn't like, it was not that we didn't know it was wrong back then, right? The sort of founders of our current industrial system, it was a good hypothesis that how we're going to scale a public education system at a scale that had never been done before. So they took a bet on that you could, an average represent most people, and then we could just rank kids against that average, and that would be good enough. And if you think about it, we still do this today. Even though our values are changing, the core of our system remains stable. So if you think about, the books we pay for, the textbook curriculum materials, we're the only industry left, the only one that incentivizes designing on average. We call it like grade appropriate or developmentally appropriate, but all that means is that you're going to design a textbook, say, for what the average fourth grader knows or can do. We will rank kids, it's been testing time right now, right? As I've been told. We will rank kids against the hypothetical average on norm reference standardized tests. We even fixed the amount of time the kids have and the sequence with which they learn, all based on what we know about learning on average, right? And it's not accidental. The architects of the system were part of what was called the Taylor movement, which was actually turning our modern factories into standardized places, and we got a lot of efficiency out of it. But it doesn't work. And I'm going to try to show you a little bit more about that. But if we want something different, if we're basically saying it's not okay to batch process and rank kids, we need to understand them and develop them, then you got to replace this with something else. And if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, I would have said, that sounds great, but what do you do instead? Again, this can't be a snowflake argument. Like, what would you replace average and deviation from average with? And I think what's really powerful to me, and the reason I'm here, is that there's been a quiet revolution across a whole range of sciences that have confronted the same failure of average to understand individuals. And I think that it has profound implications for how we would build a foundation for a future education system. I'm going to give you one example of this new science. I'll give you some more when we get closer to education. It's a big, bright picture. I can see all your faces now. So how many of you know glycemic index, blood sugar levels, you're trying to diet, you're trying to stay or just be healthy. So for a very long time, until very recently, the way we calculated how much a particular item of food elevates your blood sugar, it's on average. So we figure out there's a lot of variation. We take an average, potato elevates your blood sugar a certain amount, right? And we create dietary guidelines for this. And if you're pre-diabetic, for example, those guidelines really, really matter, right, to try to keep you healthy. So just recently, like about a year ago, there was a big study in Israel by scientists who were part of this new science of individuality. And they decided they were going to look, like how good did averages do when it came to understanding your nutrition around blood sugar. So they get thousands of people first wave through. They do incredibly deep dive into giving you systematically different kinds of food over the course of weeks and weeks and seeing how it's affecting your blood sugar. First thing they find, there's no average nutrition. It doesn't represent anybody. But what's really powerful is that they were able to use this science and some machine learning techniques to optimize nutrition for every single individual. Here's where it gets really important and practical. For some people, no kidding, this is like my dream come true, ice cream was better than bread for you. One person had ice cream was actually better than broccoli, which I cannot believe. I actually called and left a message for the Israeli scientists. I'm like, that can't be right. You got to tell my wife. Like, this is amazing. Here's a really practical story from this research that why it matters that we get away from this and why we're never having average nutrition again. In some countries, if you're pre-diabetic and you don't follow the prescribed nutrition, or they can prove you were grossly negligent about that, you can actually lose your life insurance. So there was a woman in this study who was pre-diabetic. And when they mapped her out, the average-based nutrition guidelines say, you can't have ice cream, you can't have bread, obviously. Tomatoes, on the other hand, even though they're technically a fruit, don't usually on average have the same kind of super high load. I mean, they're not great, but they're not awful. For this woman, tomatoes were literally the worst thing she could eat. She'd better off to eat ice cream, better off to eat bread, anything. Tomatoes are like the thing she shouldn't be eating. But she's actually confronted now with a genuine problem. We can optimize her nutrition, but it violates the average-based guidelines. And in theory, she could lose her life insurance, right? Probably not, but she could. Or she could actually follow the average-based nutrition guidelines and probably become a diabetic. So it matters. And by the way, this, if you want to know about this, if you Google personalized nutrition, they have a website, you can send in stuff, they can actually do this for you, and it's free. So if you ever want to know what your actual optimal nutrition is. Okay, that's fine enough for nutrition. This new science is pretty cool. It's been applied everywhere where we've had data. The whole of personalized medicine or precision medicine, those insights have all come once we got away from averages and we started looking at patterns of individuality. For education, though, I think it matters because it gives us a stable, scalable way to think about individuals. So for the rest of my talk, I want to introduce you to these 3 principles of individuality that we use to understand individuals that I think is quite valuable for education. Jaggedness, context, and pathways. So the first principle of individuality, the jaggedness principle, super simple, it's this. Any human characteristic that you care about is always multidimensional and can never be reduced to a single score. Now again, during testing time, this is fun, right? Let me show you what I mean by this. By telling you a story about the first time we ever realized there was no such thing as average body size. It came in the early 1950s, the US Air Force. So we had just made the jump from propellers to jet-powered aviation, which is an enormous technological innovation there. And we now have planes, we've invested massive amounts of money in these planes that can go close to the speed of sound, have onboard radar, serve missiles, everything, okay? And the promise was to Congress, if you fund all of this, the performance is going to be amazing, right? Because that's why you're going to spend this money. But the exact opposite happened. Pilots were just performing terribly, to the point not only just like their performance declined, but a huge spike in accidents and even deaths, right? And it got so bad that some people just started thinking it was part of the culture now. Like, it's just hard, it's dangerous to be a pilot. That was kind of the culture that was building up. But the performance problems, the Air Force, they had to figure this out. I mean, they'd spent all this money. And they did this thing that kind of feels like education, the sort of blame game. It's kind of interesting to see. First, they blame the pilots. And no kidding, it seems like a little too on the nose, but like a general in Congress he actually said, look, this new generation of pilots are just spoiled, right? Back in my day, we didn't have this technology. It basically literally said, I don't think they have the right stuff. And I was like, really, the right stuff? Like, this is but that blame didn't work because we had World War II aces that were having the same problems, right? So then they blamed the flight instructors. You're not teaching them right. Things have changed, better technology. So they revamped instruction, didn't affect it. They finally did figure out the source of the problem, and it really was a pretty unlikely place. It was the design of the cockpit. So here's why. The first time, anytime you build a cockpit, like anything, you're trying to standardize something that will fit as many people as possible, right? And people obviously have different body sizes. So the question was always, how would you build one cockpit that would accommodate the most people? So the military had a design philosophy that went all the way back to the Civil War, which was, if you want to design anything to accommodate most people, you design it for the average body size. So this is what they'd done with the first cockpit. They had taken the pilots they had in 1922. They measured them on about 10 dimensions of size that mattered at that time, took the average and built a cockpit. So the generals in the late 40s, early 50s said, oh, okay, so we've gotten bigger, which we had better nutrition, better kinds of things. So we just need a better average. So they commissioned my favorite person, I shouldn't say the whole world, there's probably other people, my kids, but good thing this is just us, right? I love my kids very much. This guy, Gilbert Daniels. So they need someone to go measure the new average. Gilbert is not a military man. I actually got to talk to him for this book, so I got to interview him. My wife said it was stalking because I was like, I want to hear from him. It's way better to hear, so I hired a private investigator, and I was like, what are you doing? And I was like, no, I just know if we got to know each other, we'd be good friends, right? But it turns out he's alive and well. He was 90, 91, and he remembered this job because it was his first job out of college. He had nothing to do with the military. He was in physical anthropology, so he was used to body size and trying to measure that. And so he said it was by far the most boring job he's ever had in his life. He was tasked with going to different Air Force bases and measuring over 4,000 pilots on 147 dimensions of size by himself with a tape measure, right? And then logging it, and then he's supposed to calculate these averages. So he's flying around, he's doing this stuff, and he says, look, when you're the only one doing the measurements, you start to see a pattern, right? This incredible variation. Sometimes you'd see a kind of tall pilot, but one of them would be heavy, but the other would be pretty slender. And so he starts questioning this idea of an average size. So he asked the military if he could do a second study around this hunch that maybe average was wrong. And they let him. They let him at night on his own dime. Right? They literally said, you're not doing it on taxpayer dollars, because they were pretty convinced, of course, average will work. So he does this, and all he does is he says, okay, I just want to know, out of the 4,093 pilots, who, by the way, were white and male, and were selected because they fit into an average size cockpit to begin with, right? Out of that group, how many of them were average on the 10 really important dimensions of size for cockpit design? And he was super generous about what he meant by average. He didn't just take the 50th percentile. He actually took the middle 30% of the distribution. So he crunches the numbers, and here's what he finds. 0. Not one of the 4,093 white male pilots who were picked because they fit into an average cockpit were actually average on these 10 dimensions of size. And it even got worse. If you just picked the top 3 dimensions of size, about 4% of the pilots were average. So Gilbert Daniels figures out that here's your problem. You've designed a cockpit that literally fits nobody. And it may not matter when you're going at the speed of whatever propellers go at, right? But when you're going close to the speed of sound, split-second decisions are life and death, and success and failure. And it starts to reveal the flaw of the design. Now, to their everlasting credit, the military, which tends to be our most conservative sort of hierarchical institution, reacted pretty quickly. Once they realized that the core assumption that average worked to understand individual pilots was wrong, they banned the use of averages in design. So they told all these companies, you want to build planes for us, you've got to accommodate, you've got to design flexible cockpits. They call it design to the edges. Now, of course, the companies were like, that's impossible, right? Like, it'll be so expensive. And they spent about a year and a half trying to convince Congress that they couldn't do it, or it would be so expensive, just it's not worth it. But really what they meant was, we don't know how, right? We know how to design good average cockpits. But since the military didn't budge, they finally got to work, and it didn't take all of a year before they figured out some pretty straightforward solutions, like adjustable seats. They didn't have adjustable seats at all in these cockpits, and adjustable pedals. When you just implemented 3 inches of adjustable height, combined with pedals that moved in and out, that's it. You went from accommodating almost no one to having decent fit for 80% of the population. So military figures it out, but it's not just about body size. That would be one thing. Although I will say as an aside, there's a huge study in Canada just recently where the clothing manufacturers wanted to figure out updated body sizes. They did the exact same thing, found the same exact result. There's no average Canadian body size. Now, assuming that's generalizable, there's nothing weird about Canadians, it still holds. There's no average body size, and if you think there is, then we end up with small, medium, large, extra large, and you think that those are just greater replications of the same person, right? It doesn't work that way. And here's why. And this is why. It's one thing to say there's no average body size, but here's why. Gilbert Daniels found when he looked at every single pilot on these 10 dimensions, he found what we call this jagged profile. Every single pilot would be on the high end on some things, on the middle on others, and on the low end on something. Every single one. This is real data from him. These are definitely not real pilots. This poor guy. He's but I couldn't find any pictures of the real pilots, so you get these guys. But here's the thing, every single one, right? Like, and this, again, is actually not, it's pretty intuitive, right? The tallest person you know isn't necessarily the heaviest person you know, right? It just turns out with height, it's multidimensional. Like height is one-dimensional, size is multidimensional. And those dimensions do not correlate like we tend to think they do. And so as a result, you cannot collapse these into a single score. If you did, by the way, with these two gentlemen, they're the same size on average, which they obviously are not, right? And it can be quite misleading. Now, it's not just size, that would still be a fun story, but it turns out this jaggedness idea shows up in every single domain of human characteristics that we've ever looked at. We found it in character. People they're not just high character people. They vary quite a bit in terms of what you mean by character. We see it in abilities, we see it in sports. That's why we have a thing called the decathlon, right? If there's, you can be good at some things, not so good at others. And we see it in intelligence. This is pretty obvious. This is an adult intelligence scale, some data we had from 2 women. They both got average scores of 103. And if you don't care to know anything about them, I guess that's good enough. You know, they're 103, that's 3 points higher than average or whatever. But if your job was to know them as individuals and develop them, it would matter quite a bit how they got there. It would matter quite a bit that they're good at verbal but not so good at visual spatial, vice versa. So we see this in every human characteristic, and you cannot reduce it to a single score if your goal is to understand people. The second principle is called the context principle. And I think this will also seem pretty intuitive. It's just, usually people in practice are like, right, and you needed science to tell you this, but we're a slow group on our end. But simply stated, it is meaningless to talk about behavior, learning, and performance independent of the immediate environment in which you're learning, behaving, and performing. The situation really matters. Let me give you 2 stories off of this to show you what I mean. The first is, have you ever heard of the marshmallow test? Okay. It's like the most iconic kind of like psychology study. It's just great. For those of you who don't, here's the short version. We think this is a good index of self-control, right? We take toddlers, we put them in a room. There's lots of variations of the study, but here's the simple one. We'll tell you, hey, here's a marshmallow or whatever you want to give them that they like. You can eat this now, or I'm going to leave the room, and if you don't eat that, when I come back, you can have 2, 3, 4, we can up the ante. And then we just leave the room, and we go behind some looking glass and watch the kid. And then we won't let them stay longer than 15 minutes, because that's probably technically torture under the Geneva Convention, but like but you just watch. And we believe that literally it's just, for every second longer that you wait, you have more self-control. And this has all been built around thinking that this self-control is something that the kid has inside of them, right? That's the way we think of it as a trait. And some kids have more, some kids have less, and we are obsessed with this. So we take these differences in marshmallow test performance. We've been doing this study for 40 years. One of my friends, Yushi Shoda, was one of the originators with some other folks. And we are just obsessed. We correlate preschool age differences with like how well you do at grade school, okay, fine. High school, okay, fine. How popular you are, how much money you make later, how happy you are in life. We just did a follow-up 40-year study with some of the first people in this task to find brain structures that were different about people who had better self-control. And on average, you can find some, right? So one of my most important studies that I've seen in a really long time that most people haven't heard of, and I think you should know this person's work, you should have her here sometime. Her name's Celeste Kidd, University of Rochester. So she, before she became a scientist, she worked in a homeless shelter for families. And it was in that location when she first heard about the marshmallow test. And she thought to herself, oh my goodness, my kids are in big trouble, right? Because every single one of them would eat the marshmallow immediately. And then it kind of made her mad. She said, why is that something about them? If you're in a homeless shelter for families, if you get something, if you don't eat it now, someone is going to take it from you. Even an adult, she said. So you learn out of necessity, you do not try to store things. Excuse me. So she does, when she becomes a scientist, she does what I'm really glad she did. Instead of just being upset about it, she did a series of really important studies. And here's what she did. She had kids come in, toddlers, do the same kind of marshmallow task, right? Bless you. But before the kids did the marshmallow test, she split them into two groups. And both groups got to do an art project first. They brought out some mugs they get to decorate, right? And in the groups, the one group had this busted up set of crayons, right? Literally like a dentist's office, like, hey, go ahead and scribble for a while. And said, hey, if you wait for a minute, I've got a great art set with some stickers and cool stuff. Just don't start drawing yet. I'll go get them, and you can have them. The one group, where what we call the adult keeps their word, came back with a brand new art set. The other group, the adult just came back and said, I'm really, really sorry. It turns out we don't have the art set, but just go ahead and use the crayons, right? Fair mistake or whatever. Okay, then you do the marshmallow task. And here's what she found. In the group where the adult keeps their word, these kids are rock stars of self-control. In fact, they were so good, all but one of them lasted the entire 15 minutes. They would have kept going because they believe that you'll do what you said you were going to do. In the group where the adult didn't keep their word, they looked like the worst ADHD kids. All but two of them ate the marshmallows in the first minute. So this is pretty profound to me because it calls into question, what is self-control? We're so quick to locate it in a kid as a trait, and we ignore the context. Now, they did a follow-up study where they tested, we have ways physiologically to tell whether someone's making a decision calm and collectively, or if it's an impulse choice. Turns out these are stone-cold, rational kids making a choice to eat the marshmallow fast, right? So, context matters. The truth is, if you're in education, you know that. You're in the context business, right? If you didn't think context matters, it would be tough to wake up every morning, right? So we have so many examples of this being true, and it makes me wonder, why are we so afraid to admit that, right? As scientists, we just love to resort to traits. And I think part of it is that once we say the situation matters, we think it's going to be super messy and complex and complicated and really make our lives difficult to figure out what's going on. Excuse me. But rather than just keep coughing, what's really cool about this science of individuality is we found when you take context seriously, it's actually quite the opposite. You end up simplifying and clarifying where averages were obscuring the real insight. And to show you what I mean, I'm going to tell you my favorite study. I have a lot of them, as you say. They're all my favorite studies. My favorite study from this science, because it's just cool. How many of you ever seen when a little baby's born, if you hold them upright, right? So I was, I had my first kid when I was 19, and as I say, my standard line is, that's not part of the talk, it's just don't take life advice from me. That's what I'm trying to say. But 19 years old, I was playing with my son Austin, and I held him up, and he started doing this. And I swear to you, I thought, oh my goodness, a prodigy. Like, I was so excited. I mean, he's walking, right? Obviously. And so I got super excited, and I was thinking of all the money we're gonna make. And I didn't care if he was an athlete or was just a circus person. You know, like, we're gonna make money on this. And so I called my mom, and I said, she's a nurse, and I said, Mom, you won't believe this. Austin's walking. And she said, you're right, I don't believe it. He's 1.5 months old, right? And so I explained it to her, and she said, oh, no, that's a stepping reflex. Don't worry, it will go away. I'm like, wait, what? So it turns out it did. Like two weeks later, it just goes away. I'm holding him up. He's not doing his part to earn money for the family. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. And we said, so turns out this step reflex, it puzzled scientists for decades. It's one of the only reflexes that disappears about 2 months of age and then reappears 8, 9, 10 months of age when the kid learns to walk. No one can figure out why. Why would a reflex disappear? So using average methods of science, we found the only correlation that we could in the 1960s, and we thought it was brain maturation. So the theory became that kids lose their step reflex because motor areas of the brain myelinate, it suppresses a reflex, then it comes back under voluntary control. It's kind of a convoluted explanation based on some weak correlations, but it was what we had. But we got so confident in that explanation that we now started putting it in pediatric textbooks. And we started using, if your kid didn't lose their stepping reflex by 2 months of age, it was a possible sign of neurological delay. We developed really intense remediation for that, right? And we were pretty good at that. And we had this nice loop. We thought this was a classic case of we know this part of how the brain works and we know how to help kids when it goes wrong. Well, one of the pioneers of this new science, a woman by the name of Esther Thalen, she kind of undid all that. And she had come from biology and she realized, you only have to have like 2 kids before you realize this is ridiculous to average kids together, right? And so she decided to really dig in and try to understand individual kids. And she did it using these kind of principles. She first measured kids' jagged profiles in terms of size. And then she started varying the context to see if it would reveal a better answer. So she put kids on treadmills, which is hilarious, little babies. It's on YouTube. It's great. I mean, they were strapped in, right? So it wasn't like just like, let's see how fast we can go, right? She put them in water to test buoyancy, right? And see this. And she did this and she stumbled on a universal insight that's true for every kid. She figured out it has nothing to do with brains. It's chubby thighs. About 2 months of age, little kids get a burst of subcutaneous fat on their thighs and they just can't lift their legs anymore, right? Their little bodies aren't strong enough and it takes a while for the rest of the body to catch up and then they can do it again, right? So I promise you've never heard of chubby thighs in the annals of science, right? It is a super simple answer, right? Like thighs, has nothing to do with the brain. So that's fun, super clean answer, but think about the practicality here. We were telling parents something might be wrong with their kids' brains. And oh, by the way, our remediation had a 99.6% success rate because nothing was wrong, right? Like, it's a good gig. You're like, trust us, we know what we're doing. But here's the thing, as long as you relied on averages, you could never discover that. It's once you took individuality seriously, once you take context seriously, not only can you learn things about things like self-control, you can discover really important insights about the nature of something like a reflex. The final principle that we use to understand individuals is called the pathways principle. And simply stated, it's this. Kids differ in the pace and sequence with which they get to outcomes, and there are always multiple pathways to success, always, period. No matter you're talking about motor development or academic development, there are always multiple pathways. In fact, it's the only law we have in this new science. It's called equifinality. With any outcome, there are always multiple pathways to success. Now, that's a problem. I'm trained in developmental systems, dynamical systems. In development, as in education, we kind of think of it like this. There's a ladder, right? Like, there's one pathway up, there's some stages that you go through or a sequence that everyone follows, and the only way you're left to vary is how fast you can climb that, right? And built into our culture, we have a view that fast is smart. Fast is always better, right? That's how, we really think, one of the great developmentalists, Jean Piaget, came to the United States for the first time, and he was like, he'd figured out these stages, and he said the first question that everyone always asked him here was, how do we make kids go faster? And he's like, why do we need kids to go faster, right? But we believe fast equals better. And if you don't believe that, if I said, hey, you're a quick learner, you think I just said you're smart. So truth be told, full disclosure, I actually thought for sure there has to be some relationship between speed and ability. Like, maybe it's not like super tight correlation, but there's gotta be something, right? On average, it's true. When you dig into the individual level stuff, it's not. This is one of the hardest things I've come to grips with in the research is there actually isn't a correlation between the pace with which you learn something and how much mastery you can actually achieve. Now that's a problem, right, if that's true, because we've arbitrarily fixed pace for learning. Given that this is the testing time right now, do you ever wonder who comes up with how much time kids have to take a standardized test? More often than not, it's actually how long it took the average kid in a representative sample to finish. And this wasn't accidental. It was the father of educational psychology, Edward Thorndike, who actually started pegging the use of averages as the amount of time kids had to learn and take tests, because he had a view of what intelligence was. He thought it was how fast your brain made connections. And he thought it was genetically determined, and some brains were just faster than others. And so he said, well, what would be the fairest thing to do in a public education system? And he said, let's just peg it to average, because yeah, the smart kids will be bored once in a while, but the truth is the slower kids aren't smart enough to take advantage of the extra time. This was the father of educational psychology who did some of the earliest standardized work in our system. And even today, if you think about it, if you need more time on a test, you have to have a certified disability. So we still have this obsession with pace and ability, and it's kind of terrifying to realize how much talent we might be destroying just as an accident of time, right? Now, I will say, some of this science is brand new and it's cool, but this kind of stuff we've known for a very long time, right? How many of you know Benjamin Bloom? It's worth, not just his taxonomy work, he is one of the pioneers of mastery-based learning, right? And 40 years ago, he did some of the most important studies around what happens when you let kids have a little flexibility in terms of the pace with which they learn. This is before we had any real technology to do something about it. I'm going to show you from his own data just 5 data points just to illustrate a point, and we can talk about the more general insights that he found. His work, he would randomly assign kids from Chicago into one group that was group instruction at that fixed pace. The other was a pretty optimal condition of self-paced, same total amount of time, right? You don't get to go on forever. But he asked, what if we had them have a tutor that helped them move at their own pace within that fixed amount of time? So he does that. In the aggregate, he finds that the kids that are in this self-paced environment typically outperform the other group by 2 standard deviations, meaning that the typical kid in the group that was self-paced was performing in the 98th percentile of the group that's at fixed pace instruction. This is one of the most replicated findings we have in this area, that when you give kids a little more pace, actually what one kid can do, most kids can do. Here's the 5 data points that he found in one study where basically, I think this was actually math as well, you're moving along. You realize we choose arbitrary times to give exams, right? Like, in this middle of the class, they give an exam, this poor kid doesn't know what they're doing, and they're gonna get a failing grade or whatever. A little bit more time, that kid ended up being the top in the class. Now, this is just 5 data points to illustrate a point, but if you've seen Khan Academy, right? You know what this is. If you don't, you probably should. Sal Khan, his TED Talk is worth watching because he was someone who had done really well on the standardized system. And he thought it meant, great, I'm just really smart. And when they opened up self-paced learning through Khan Academy and they start looking at the data, this is what he finds over and over again. Basically, if you're looking at how kids are learning, if you take some middle point and rank the kids, it tells you next to nothing of who's going to end up being where when it's all said and done. And his basic view now is that most of what we see in achievement is just an accident of time. Now, what do we do about that? You can't give every kid unlimited time, right? But we certainly can start thinking about things like decoupling age-based cohorts and rigid fixed amounts of time for kids to learn, especially when we know that there's no relationship between pace and ability. Okay, so we step back and say, averages don't work if you want to understand individuals. It's not a hypothesis. We actually know empirically. We also have a mathematical theorem that proves why it's true. So you're never going to see average-based medicine again. You're never going to see average-based nutrition. You wouldn't even accept it, right? Whenever anyone tells me, well, maybe averages are okay, kind of, right? I just give them this little puzzle. God forbid you get cancer. God forbid you get colorectal cancer. I'll give you two choices. We have molecular fingerprinting to do individualized cancer treatment, or you can have the gold standard average-based treatment. You're never choosing, I don't care how gold standard it is, you're never choosing average-based cancer treatment because it doesn't work. So we know something better now. We actually have a principled way to think about individuality that is the foundation for new medicine, it's the foundation for nutrition, and it can be the foundation for a system of education that understands and develops kids, right? So I'm going to give you one last story. It's the reason I wrote the book and the reason actually I'm stepping away from just full-time academia and we started a nonprofit to get to the public and have a conversation. Because I naively, as a scientist, thought that facts are all that matter, right? Like, I know that seems stupid, right? Like, but I thought, look, wait, we know this now, right? So, ta-da, like, things change, right? They don't, right? Mindset matters quite a bit. And so the reason I wrote the book, and the reason I'm here talking today, is because of this last story I'm going to tell you. It turns out the Air Force wasn't the first group to figure out there's no such thing as average body size. 7 years before that, the head of the American Gynecological Association, Robert Dickinson, had decided as a gift to the rest of the field of physicians, he was going to, at his own great personal cost, construct a statue of the average woman. Because as he believed, that's typical, right? And you need to know what typical is to know what atypical is. So he does this. He collects data on over 100, I think it was 150, something, I can't remember the exact number, lots of dimensions of size, including toe length, on like thousands upon thousands of women. And you can imagine exactly what kind of women got included and didn't get included, but he calculates averages on all of them. Again, I don't know what the average toe length was, but I don't know. But he then commissions a sculpture to be made. And not surprisingly, he calls it Norma. Because average is normal. And there, by the way, there was a Norman, no one cared. There was a guy that no one cared. On the other hand, Norma became a runaway sensation in the United States. If you Google this, it is so bizarre. She became a sensation. Like, articles were written about her. I'm not kidding you, a pastor wrote about Norma's typical religion. She was on a national talk show. She didn't have much to say because she's a statue, but like, there she was. And they were reading out her dimensions so women could know whether they were normal. It got so crazy that they did a Norma lookalike contest. They took 9 dimensions of her body and they started running ads in the paper all over the country. And they offered a $100 war bond, which was quite a bit of money back then, for Norma. Now, it was a gimmick because they wanted to get people accustomed to normal physical body size and stuff like that. And it was done by the Cleveland Health Museum, who bought the rights to the first statue, and they wanted people to come see her. They were so convinced that most women would be Norma that they needed a way to prove that they didn't just, there was a fair way to choose which woman got the war bond. So they allowed the YMCA, which I would think is hilarious, to be the arbiter of who got the award. So thousands of women, the ads were like, find your girlfriend, have her measure you. It was supposed to be this fun thing you do, right, together. Submit your dimensions, and thousands of women did. These are all women that thought they must look something like Norma, right? And you get, it bothers me to see that too long. They get the results, and they award the winner, a woman named Martha Skidmore. They put her on a pedestal, literally, took a picture of her next to Norma, and put it in the paper. And they got letter to the editor after letter to the editor saying, she looks nothing like Norma. What's going on? And so they finally had to admit, oh, okay. Turns out, out of all the thousands of women that submitted their dimensions, the winner was only average on 3 out of the 9. And no one else was really close. So here we are. They get the exact same data as the Air Force. There's no average woman in terms of body size. It's just a ridiculous concept. You would think if facts were enough, if data was enough, that we would have abandoned that misguided ideal, right? That's not what happened. So Bruno Gebhardt, who was the physician in charge of this little fiasco, goes in the newspaper and he says, hey, look, I know what the problem is. American women are profoundly unfit. And health and exercise is the answer. And I'm not kidding you. They actually made miniature replicas of Norma, sent them to high schools. And they had PE programs where young women had their bodies measured against Norma and prescribed exercise accordingly. We have one of the replicas at Harvard. We're very proud of it. We're not proud of it. And so, what does that matter today? So we know that our system of education has to do something a little different, right? We don't have all the answers. Nobody does right now. But I do think we think it's going to be a little more personalized, whatever it is. And my friends in the ed tech sector, because technology is going to be a necessity, right? You're going to need that to do whatever we're going to do. It's not the answer, but it is a tool. They have a similar sort of misguided belief that if we just collect more data on kids, if we just have more technology, that we will build things that are better and more fair for kids in general, right? But if Norma is any guide, I'm not sure that's true, right? We'll collect more data, but how the interpretation really matters. How we choose to use that data will either lead us to a place where we really believe that every kid has something to offer and that we're building systems that understand every kid and develop them, or we'll use it to double down on a 19th century view of average people and sink one-dimensional rank order, and we will exacerbate the inequalities we already have, and we will never get close to developing the talent we need as a society. So I'm actually, that sounds bad, I'm pretty optimistic about what's possible. It's going to be very challenging, but I think you've got a couple of good solutions with a shift in mindset. At the end of the day, we've got to get rid of this nonsensical idea that you can understand people on average and start appreciating individuality. Thank you.